Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics, and this week we're going to be talking about off-axis shooting. Now, some of you have probably seen photos or video, one of the rifles I use, and it has an RDS and a 45-degree RDS. And I always get the question, why would I run a rifle like that? Why would it make sense to have an RDS here and then a second RDS here? Now, you see a lot of people, they run a 1-to-4 and they'll have backup iron sights or an RDS at the 45. And for a lot of people that makes sense, because if you're zoomed into maximum magnification and you suddenly need to take a close shot, you can just rotate the rifle 45, pick up your sight profile or your red dot and use that optic for that particular engagement. But when it comes to something like this, a lot of people are like, well, that doesn't make much sense because they're both non-magnified, which is correct. But this optic allows me to engage off-axis or half off-axis at the 45 if the rifle is not able to be used in the traditional shooting position. And I'm going to explain exactly what I mean as we get into this. Now, everybody's familiar with traditional prone. Some people say put the mag on the deck, some people say don't put the mag on the deck, some people say get some support, whatever. Some people use the C-clamp, some people use the mag well, some people go all the way out front. However you're doing it, whatever works best for you. I was introduced to this position in the military. It's one of the military's favorites. For a long time, the military figured almost every war would be fought from this position, so it was beat into our heads. I wasn't introduced into off-axis prone, or at the time, it was introduced to me as special boat team prone. I was taking a precision rifle class, law enforcement sniper class, and it was introduced to us because the instructor had many deployments, call-outs, whatever you want to call them, where his only available shot position forced him to shoot the rifle from a non-traditional position. So he instructed it. The history of it, I guess, at least as he knew it, it was invented by either SEALs or Rangers, not really sure which, and they used it to lay across the gunwale of a rib so they could have guns downriver as they're moving down a river, surreptitious entry or whatever you want to call it. So they're able to deploy the weapon systems and maintain a very minimal profile inside the boat. Basically all it is tilting the rifle 45 or 90 degrees off axis and getting your head behind the optic. Now with a traditional optic, like I'm using this 1 MOA RDS, this RMR, if I lay it over, it's very difficult for me to get my head behind it. I still can, but it's difficult. With a 45, it's a lot easier to get the gun low and get on the optic. Now, does that cause a point of impact, or I should say, does that cause a point of aim, point of impact difference? Yes, it does. Let's talk about the science of it.
Gravity plays the largest part in bullet behavior and how we compensate for it. An old myth that's still around is that the bullet rises as it leaves the barrel, which is false. The bullet begins to drop as soon as it leaves the barrel because that's what gravity demands. Gravity's effect on the bullet is in direct proportion to its time in flight. Handguns and rifles compensate for this reality in slightly different ways, though both have to do with design and the sights. Handguns have a lower bore axis than the average rifle, but this mechanical offset between barrel and sight is compensated for with sight height and depth, allowing for a gross .0 distance, usually 25 yards. With rifles, everything is built around the distance shooting, and conversely, close quarter shooting requires a different skill set altogether. A rifle's sight or optic is elevated from the barrel, and often, especially with magnified precision optics aiming long distances, forces the shooter to elevate the barrel of the rifle to compensate for gravity. Of course, there are other factors that affect the path of the bullet, such as wind, ballistic coefficient, humidity, elevation, spin drift, rotation of the earth, etc. But for the practical purposes of an off-axis shooting, our biggest concern is with the mechanical offset, the height of the sight optic from the center line of the barrel, and the degree of cant. We can compensate for gravity in shooting off-axis just as we do shooting traditionally. It just requires more knowledge and practice. Mechanical offset varies from weapon to weapon and significantly from optic to optic in relation to the weapon. The closer the sights or optics are to the center of the bore of the weapon, the less exaggerated the effects of offset will be when shooting the rifle in a canted position. So what are these effects? Put simply, when the weapon is canted off its intended vertical axis, the bullet path will be altered off the point of aim, impacting in the direction of the optic and low. The greater the distance, the more exaggerated the difference between the point of aim and the point of impact. Why does this happen? It isn't magic. Your visual point of aim is your visual axis, which remains the same in relation to your point of aim even when you can't see the bore axis. The barrel of the rifle is now aimed at a different point even though the optic or sights are not. This adds a cant trajectory into the path of the bullet because of gravity and rotation of the barrel. Because sights optics compensate for gravity by elevating the barrel of the rifle or handgun, canting sights shifts the arc and in so doing drops the point of impact and pushes it in the direction the optic or the sights are canted. The easiest way I've found to remember this is sights and low for where I can expect the bullet to go from the point of aim with the weapon canted.
Now, just as demonstrated, the more extreme the cant on the weapon, the bigger the difference in the point of aim, point of impact. This is also an issue for handguns. Now, with any firearm, the way the ballistics are going to work is the bullet is going to go low and in the direction of the optic. So if my off axis is this way, the round will strike low and will strike in the direction of the optic. If I cant the rifle this way for some reason, it'll strike low and in the direction of the optic. Low and right, low and left, depending on which way you tilt the weapon. Now, that factors in greater at either the distance you are from your threat or the size of the profile of the target that's available to you. If I have a very small exposure, not practical accuracy being the head or high thoracic, but precision accuracy, I only have a small portion of the face or a foot or something like that exposed to me, it's going to be more of an issue at distance. Now, realism obviously factors into this, but again, we know there's a million possible variables in any self-defense situation. So if all I have is a very small target profile available to me and the target's 10, 15, 20, 40 yards away, that's going to factor into the point of aim and the actual point of impact of the bullet based on how extreme the cant of the weapon is. Now, someone might ask, well, gee, Aaron, why count the rifle at all? It doesn't really make sense. Like, you're in the prone, you're good to go, why would you cant the rifle? And to me, the answer to that is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Rifle or handgun. We may find ourselves behind a piece of cover or concealment or in a situation where the traditional prone or a traditional crouching shooting position might not work very well. Even in the most extreme situation, you think of like in a home defense situation, you may have to shoot under a bed, under furniture, something like that. For law enforcement, military, or perimeter defense, depending on the situation you find yourself in, you may have to shoot under a sedan or an SUV. Most people think, oh, an SUV, like they sit high enough, I can get a traditional prone. And to them, I'd say, depending on where it's parked, depending on the situation, depending on the distance of the threat, the angle of the threat, and depending on the height of the vehicle to your rifle. Have you ever actually taken your rifle and tried to prone underneath your vehicles? Can you use a traditional prone shooting position? Can you do it with a handgun? Now, take a target and start moving it closer or further away from your vehicle. Use a full body target. If you got to take two silhouettes, one to simulate the legs and the other one to simulate the actual torso, go for the average height of 5'7" to 6 foot and move it all around at different varied distances to see just how easy or difficult it is for you to engage the target from a low cover. Not necessarily having to shoot underneath something, but also think of a situation where you have to take cover behind a very, very small object such as a curb or a rock in the garden or what have you. You may find if you need to minimize your exposure to the target, prone, you sit up kind of high compared to how low you'll be in an off-axis shooting situation where you can get super low to the ground. Some people say prone isn't very practical for self-defense, and to them I say you're using a crystal ball in that point and you're already predicting the situation that someone's going to get into, and that's just wrong. Prone is a very viable shooting position for the rifle and for the handgun, depending on the situation you may find yourself in. And since you can find yourself in a situation where prone makes a whole lot of sense, wouldn't it best behoove you to know how to shoot from prone traditional and an off-axis prone? Now, the traditional prone position, shooting under a vehicle, an SUV or truck stock height might not still be high enough to get the weapon into a traditional prone position. So, tilting it 45 to 90 degrees, whichever direction you're able to do it in a prone position, if that's the position you have available to you, makes a lot more sense. Now, with smaller sedans, this is more of an issue because they sit lower to the ground. But in this situation, even with my truck's ride height, stock height, I still cannot get a clear objective on a threat that I have placed out there 100 meters away. So in this situation, I would have to go to a 45 or a full 90. Now, obviously more concerning if I need to minimize my exposure to the threat. A very popular position is urban prone, or what they call broke back prone, or whatever the term you're going to use for it. Basically, I'm using the tire as concealment and partial cover, depending on the weapon I'm facing, depending on the situation, and I'm simply going to invert, and the weapon is still going to be at a 90-degree angle. So off-axis still comes into play in this situation. Again, the further the threat is away from you, the more the point of aim, point of impact difference is going to factor in. Now, as a practical demonstration, I got a threat out there at 100 meters. I'm going to fire 3 rounds from a traditional prone position, and I'm going to fire 3 rounds from the off-axis prone position, just to show you the point of aim, point of impact deviation. Now, I consider 100 meters to be on the outside extreme of this shooting position. If you're 100 meters from your threat, you may be able to solidify your position, get a better position, or use a traditional prone shooting position. But, as you can see, point of aim, point of impact for traditional prone, point of aim, point of impact off axis. So I was aiming here off axis, my hits were here. As we already talked about, the shots are going to be low, and they're going to be in the direction of the optic or the sights. So that's what you get. Is the deviation great? No, it's not great at all. But the deviation can be a huge factor depending on the size of the target you have available to you. If my point of aim is extremely small, what we consider a precise shot, if I only have partial of the head available to me or something like that, or a foot or what have you, my point of aim, the available target, the available threat is going to be very small. So this deviation can definitely factor into that, even at close ranges. Now, the closer you are to the threat, the less the deviation is going to be, but it's still going to be present. Now, in a traditional sedan height, such as this sits a little higher than some cars, a little lower than others. It's definitely lower than your average SUV, even your average crossover. But as you can see, that's not a lot of room. In fact, if I try to prone out underneath it, my optic wouldn't even clear, and my barrel is impacting with the ground effects. So I would have to cant the weapon and go lower, or if I don't want to expose myself like that, I can come over here to the tire, if my slings run all the way out, and come under like this. Now, this requires shoulder-to-shoulder transitions. There's no way you're going to be able to use your urban or your broke-back prone, most likely, from your primary shooting shoulder. This is another reason why we want to keep our sling run all the way out when our hands are on the gun. It allows us to instantly transition shoulders. Now, I can come all the way over and switch hands, or I can simply come all the way over, go underneath, make my quick shot or two, come back up, and move from there if I can. There's just no way, as I've already demonstrated, on a traditional sedan height to use the traditional prone position. And in an urban prone, there's no way to get the rifle, even if the vehicle height would allow it, into a traditional prone position. Now, the handgun in my life is a little bit easier. I can go into a full fetal, and if the room's available to me, I can support off my thighs. Basically, invert onto the side you're going to shoot from, and then I can bring my knees up, support the gun between them, and then angle my body to change my point of aim. It seriously reduces your mobility. You can also just come under, just like this, slight can on the weapon. You have a lot of options available to you with the handgun that you don't necessarily have with the rifle. We don't want to necessarily suck up the cover unless we're going to use the car as support. A lot of people say, you know, during the day, off cover, at night, on cover, to get your light past cover so you don't backsplash yourself. But if we can use the vehicle for support, or the cover for support, to stable our shot, it's definitely beneficial. Not always recommended, basically depending on your situation. If you're available, that's great. But with the handgun, I can go left, I can go right, I can do whatever I need to do, and I can pretty much stay out of that traditional prone position with the handgun, because as anybody who's tried it knows, shooting from prone with a handgun is not ideal just because of the mechanics that are needed to run a handheld weapon versus a shoulder-supported weapon. And obviously, not just for prone, you could find yourself in a standing position, and based on the piece of cover concealment you're using or the situation you find yourself in, have a need to cant the weapon, you know, a slight degree, even to a full 90 degree or more, depending on the situation. Everybody's pretty familiar with one of these slat walls or notch walls. They are pretty much unrealistic because you don't see a lot of things like this out there in the world with so many options, but they do teach you that different options exist based on your piece of cover. Now, most of these presentations I can use with the traditional straight up and down, your straight up and vertical profile of the weapon. But on these notches here, because of the optic height over the bore, I might have to cant the weapon slightly to extreme depending on my presentation, what's available to me. That isn't going to change your point of aim, point of impact. Again, based on the distance to the target is going to be how big of a difference there is between your point of aim and your point of impact, and if you need to hold over, how extreme that hold is going to be. As hopefully I've been able to show you, there are some things you have to take into consideration when you're using an off-axis. Even if it's not the traditional off-axis, I showed you the special boat team prone, whatever you want to call it. Anytime you cant the weapon, it's going to affect your point of aim, point of impact. Again, distance obviously exaggerates it. So you have to factor in your holdovers. And with the weapon at a full 90, your elevation becomes your windage becomes your elevation. The more precise you need to be, or the further you need to shoot, the more it's going to be a factor. But even at close ranges, it can factor into your more precise versus your practical accuracy shots. Something you definitely want to work into your practice. And as I showed with the rifle, and even it factors into the handgun as well, you may not always be able to shoot from your primary side. If you have a piece of cover that forces you to go underneath a car and switch shoulders with the rifle, something you need to practice for. Get outside your comfort zone and work on this. Obviously you're limited by your training area. If you don't have access to an outdoor range, it does kind of complicate these skills, but you can still practice them in a dry fire on your own vehicle in your own home, wherever you need to do it at. This is definitely something you need to include in your practice and your training, because you never know what situation you're going to be presented with and how that situation is going to force the way you're able to use the weapon effectively. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly. Just be like, hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. This week we're going to be talking about gangster style ballistics. Not a good title? Alright, we'll go with off-axis shooting then.